Okay, you're on.
All right, thank you, Arpin, and thank you everybody who's watching today, who's going to be following along with our thermal comfort modeling, our part one of thermal comfort modeling in Honeybee, and we're going to be covering a lot of stuff actually in this. This is going to be actually largely a setup for the next comfort on presentation on thermal comfort modeling, which will happen this upcoming Tuesday. Where we'll really be getting detailed into mapping out microclimates. But just to give you a sense of the overall schedule of everything that's happening, so we covered some basic energy modeling stuff in the last two sessions before we kind of had a bit of a break for the last week, which is very nice. So essentially now we've kind of gotten a sense, we've covered a lot of energy modeling basics about how to set up energy models. And now we're going to apply this really to a specific design project in this today's workshop. We're going to be trying to we're still going to be using an energy model, but we're going to be using it to help us eliminate a cooling system, to make a completely passive design for a hot climate in a residence. And so we're going to be going over a lot of sort of passive strategies, how to apply those in Honeybee, and eventually by the end of it we're going to start to really get a sense of spatial comfort and get into multi-zone modeling. And then finally on next Tuesday we're going to get really deep. We're going to start making high-resolution thermal comfort maps out of our energy simulations and going deep into the metrics that we can use to quantify how comfortable our spaces are. So, all right, so with that, I'm going to dive into today's schedule. As I said, we got a lot on the menu here. I'm just going to start off, I'm going to give just a brief recap of indoor comfort models because we kind of already, I mentioned them all the way back in the Ladybug tutorials. I've given a kind of brief history, and I'll just reiterate that very quickly because I know some people have already seen it probably if they're following the whole series. Then we're going to create an energy model of a house just from closed poly surfaces. We're going to calculate and visualize comfort from that energy model. We're going to turn that building into something completely passive instead of conditioned, which is the default. And then we're going to apply a bunch of passive strategies, including operable windows, shade, ceiling fans, etc., to this model to see how it improves the comfort. And then finally, we're going to be taking that same model, turning it into a multi-zone, multi-room model, and then starting to understand that not all spaces are created equally in terms of their thermal comfort, and really understanding that. So all right, so just to start off with, again, with our recap here, and to say, well, first to say where we are kind of in the whole project. Everything we're doing today pretty much is within Honeybee. Of course, Honeybee builds off of Ladybug, so there is some Ladybug components that we're using. But primarily, everything that we're doing in Honeybee is related to this Open Studio Energy Plus connection. We're not getting into the daylight or the Therm window modeling yet. Those will be for later sessions. And these two sessions here on comfort will be the last time that we're really covering the energy modeling stuff in Honeybee. So, all right, so with that, just to give a recap of the indoor thermal comfort models that we already kind of know. So, as you guys might remember that I said from the second session on Ladybug, there are two main comfort models in Ladybug and Honeybee. And just to give you a brief history of them, the first model that sort of was ever officially published and endorsed as an international standard by ASHRAE and the ISO was what was called the PMV model. And the way that came to be was that a guy, awesome scientist named Fanger, stuck people in a climate chamber, really tightly controlled conditions where he controlled the surfaces, the air temperature, the wind speed, and everything. And then after they sat there for an hour, he would say, all right, how do you feel? Do you feel hot? Do you feel cold? And he would take measurements of their clothing, of their activities and metabolic rates, and he did this thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Until finally he tried to correlate all of these results that he got from his climate chamber tests to essentially to what he said were 6 key factors that he needed in order to say if someone was comfortable or not. And these are the 6 factors here. Those are air temperature, those are humidity, which is related to exhalation and perspiration, radiant temperature, which is the temperature of those surfaces, wind speed, which is self-explanatory, and then clothing and metabolic rate. And specifically, he said that a lot of these terms have to do with heat leaving the body, like the air temperature, humidity, and wind speed. And essentially what he's doing is that he's balancing the heat that is generated by the body through the metabolic activity with the heat that leaves the body through these other different environmental sources. And of course clothing, which mitigates in between these two. And so he basically just said he used the first law of thermodynamics, and he said that that heat leaving the body has to equal the heat that's generated by the body. And he correlated this with all of his survey results and produced the PMV model, which again depends upon, this is just the ladybug component for it, but depends upon these 6 inputs of air temperature, radiant temperature, wind speed, relative humidity, metabolic rate, and clothing. And so this became then officially endorsed as an international standard. It was applied in practice. I mean, I guess this was around the 60s or 70s where it really became official. And it's still very common practice today that people will try and visualize PMV comfort by plotting results on a psychrometric chart like what you see here, where you essentially have dry bulb temperature on the x-axis, you have humidity, absolute humidity on the y-axis, and then you essentially will use the PMV model to plot out the region that is comfortable on this chart. Basically, although this polygon moves around a lot based on all those 6 factors, not just air temperature and humidity. So, all right, so we have one PMV model, and once this was produced, a lot of engineers started using it. You know, it was used to derive all the thermostat set points that we use in a lot of our public buildings. But once that came to be, immediately a bunch of scientists said, all right, well, that's great that, you know, we have all these climate chamber tests that validated the model. You know, and it's great that, you know, we have a human energy balance here, but how do we know this really relates to what people actually feel in real buildings? I mean, we know it describes that climate chamber really well. And so these researchers, Didier et al., one of the first ones, although there were a lot of actually researchers before him in Europe especially, who went around and did thousands and thousands of surveys and measured the PMV people in real buildings and assembled this all into one big publicly available database that you can still check out today, all publicly available and online. And then they analyzed the data to see, so, you know, are they actually getting PMV values predicted well with their data set? And so, I mean, many of you already probably know what correlations are, but they used essentially statistical correlations to say how well is the PMV model telling, you know, how well correlated is it to what people actually say they feel, or they feel hot or cold in real buildings. And a correlation of 0 would mean that there's no relationship between the two, they're scattered all over the place. A correlation of 1 would mean that it's perfectly 1-to-1, which never exists in reality, and more often than not, they were expecting to see something like this, where you're in between the two. And so, essentially, taking that, they found, let's say, so first they took, let's say, the air temperature of all their spaces that they measured and saw how well correlated this was to their comfort votes. And understandably, this is pretty far from 1, but, you know, but it's not 0. So I mean, this is kind of to be expected. This is, you know, some proof that the methodology was working, that they were getting some type of correlation here. But what they found, though, is that when they took all of their buildings all together, and they said, all right, so how well correlated is the PMV of all these people that we've measured? And they measured PMV by taking note of everyone's clothing, by taking note of their activities to assess their metabolic rate, and by measuring all those other factors like air temperature and humidity. And they calculated the PMV for each person, and they looked at how well correlated that was to what people actually said in these real buildings. And amazingly, they found that not only was the correlation kind of bad in and of itself, as low as like 0.21, but it would actually have been better if they just took the air temperature and tried to use that as their indicator of whether people were comfortable or not. So this was a big shock to the community that PMV, even though it was being used across the industry as a standard, and it still is today, of course, used as a standard, endorsed by ASHRAE and the ISO. But it was just a realization that maybe this PMV model really isn't so good for all the cases that we think they are. And one of the big reasons why it wasn't so good is that in this survey that Didier et al. Did is that they had both naturally ventilated and conditioned buildings. And what we came to realize is that PMV really isn't suitable. It's such a poor predictor of people's comfort within passive buildings, within fully passive buildings. And that really that people are much more comfortable at warmer temperatures than what the PMV model would say. So that was one of the key things that we realized from this study. And so we realize now that you're not really supposed to use PMV really for anything other than a tightly conditioned building or a building that resembles that climate chamber. But the amazing thing that Didier et al. Did find in this whole study, and probably the more important than just understanding that PMV was not so good, was that if they only looked at the naturally ventilated buildings, only looked at these passive buildings, they saw that people's comfort votes were really, really well correlated, almost very close to 1 to the average outdoor air temperature. So essentially, in other words, what he's saying is probably summarized in his graphic right here, that if you take the daily mean outdoor temperature, that prevailing outdoor temperature averaged over the season essentially, or over the month, and you take the temperature that people want to have on the inside on the y-axis here, this neutral temperature, the temperature people want, you get this really strong linear relationship between the two. That's very close to 1, around like 0.9. And it only exists though for naturally ventilated buildings. As soon as you start to condition the space, the correlation breaks down. It's not as good. Although, I mean, arguably PMV wasn't so good as a start in the first place. But essentially, the important thing was that he used this correlation he found in naturally ventilated buildings to build a new comfort model that we now know today is the adaptive comfort model that has 4 inputs. So it actually doesn't even have humidity in it, but it essentially really just relies on the air temperature in your space, the radiant temperature in that space, and weights those in relation to the prevailing outdoor temperature. And they've also built in some things for wind speed. But so essentially, all that this is, to really summarize the adaptive model, is that as the outdoor temperature gets warmer and warmer, that average outdoor air temperature, the temperature that people are going to desire on the inside, that indoor operative temperature, is also going to go up and up and up. And so it's not a perfect, one-to-one slope. So people actually want colder temperatures. If it's 80, if the prevailing outdoor temperature is 88, people are still going to want temperatures around 80 on the inside. So it's not a perfect one-to-one, but generally this relationship is linear, and we can draw a comfort polygon around this area that would be comfortable. All right, so that's essentially the adaptive model. But really to kind of talk about now, I know that was kind of all review, but now to really talk about what the state of comfort science is today, how it exists currently today, and how it's applied in practice. It's really important to recognize that, all right, so that we have one comfort model, the PMV comfort model, that is does a pretty good job of characterizing comfort in fully conditioned buildings. That we know it works well for fully conditioned buildings. Fanger validated against the climate chamber. We know it works there. And then we have another model that only works pretty much for fully passive buildings, which is that adaptive model. And what we have is this really strong division between the two. That there is, we don't have anything that really describes the in-between states of these, which is problematic. And it's really what ends up happening is just to say that we don't have any comfort models for mixed mode or hybrid passive buildings, buildings that have both air conditioning and are expected to be naturally ventilated for some time of the year. There's really no recommendation for that, and really the ASHRAE and the ISO pretty much just say, we don't know, use PMV is really the suggestion right now, but it's clearly not a very satisfactory scientific answer. What else we don't have a thermal comfort model for? We don't have a comfort model for how we should transition between summertime natural ventilation in colder climates and wintertime heating. That at just some point we're just supposed to switch comfort models, and we know that people's comfort doesn't really just switch like that. It's got probably a bit more of a gradual transition. And so we don't really have a good sense of that yet. Nor do we really have a good sense of, as I said, humidity is not in the adaptive comfort model. So we don't really have an understanding of how these conditions of high humidity actually really affect the model. And all attempts to date to integrate humidity into the adaptive model, it's important to say, have resulted in poor correlations to people's comfort. So really, so we haven't really described well what exactly is the effect of humidity on people's comfort, because it's clearly not a linear relationship or something that is easily described as what we've already found with the outdoor temperature. And so if anyone is thinking of doing a PhD program and wants to help the world, these things are really important things that need to come to fruition in the next few years, really, in the next few decades, if we're really going to be able to have satisfactory ways of designing with this. And really to sort of say, all right, if this is the state of comfort science, that we have this clear division between these two models, what happens in practice? Well, more often than not, what tends to happen is that I mean, because we don't really have the scientifically satisfactory explanation for how we might transition between these two, or how we really should be designing. What ends up happening is that everyone basically uses the PMV model still, and by and large, even though the adaptive model has been published by ASHRAE and endorsed by ASHRAE and the ISO, really everyone, for the most part, it's very rare that you find situations of people using the adaptive comfort model. And so I say, I mean, somewhat controversially here, that they're somewhat faking their passive design when they do this. And the passive strategies that they're applying really aren't. I mean, I guess I mean to say is that they're applying these strategies without changing the comfort model and understanding how people's comfort actually changes when you switch from a fully conditioned building to a fully passive building. And so, I mean, for example, of what I mean by kind of faking it a little bit is that, let's say, we'll put in operable windows in our building, but there'll be these types of awning windows which don't get very good airflow rates, that really aren't actually really doing much in terms of passive design, except just to say that yes, we can we can put a check mark in the box that says we've got operable windows, essentially. And so this is really, I mean, it's problematic that we're really still treating our buildings as if they're fully conditioned using a fully conditioned comfort model, and we're only just gradually just slapping on passive strategies here and there instead of actually changing the way that the building really functions thermally and really embracing passive design. And so this is a bit problematic, largely because, I mean, I guess just as I say, I mean, I can't really blame the practice at large because the science really isn't satisfactory yet. And we do need a lot more research to help us get there. But really, I mean, if I could target the heart of why everyone is using this right now, it's largely just because that same thing that I mentioned all the way back in the first webinar series, that people I mean, when we build buildings, we expect them to last a long time. We expect them to perform, to meet people's comfort. We have all these expectations that we put on buildings. And because of that, we tend to stick to the things that we already know work. And because we already know that conditioning the space and using this comfort model works, we just keep sticking to that instead of being experimental and actually moving to the responsible things that we really should be doing as we try to save more energy in the coming decades. And I mean, and it's a really tough thing to overcome, to try and overcome just the fact that the building industry is slow moving and we're incentivized to do the same things that we already know rather than changing things up. And so really, I mean, though, we should say, all right, if we continue on this route of simply doing the things that we already know work, of always conditioning all of our buildings, what are going to be the consequences of this? Like, I mean, why can't we just stick to this right now? What are the consequences of actually sticking with a PMV comfort model and conditioning all buildings across, all new buildings that we're creating? And so the real issue that is going to rise, and especially, I mean, it's already rising and is going to be critical in the next few decades, is that we're going to see that the tropical and arid regions of the world are going to urbanize incredibly, so very, very much so. And if all that these tropical and arid regions of the world have is a PMV comfort model and condition strategies to work with, all those new buildings, all that doubling of the urban population of the world that is going to happen in the next few decades is going to happen with air conditioning. It's going to happen with buildings that are only made to work with that type of air conditioning. And so we say, all right, so that happens, that the world urbanizes. And then so because of that, because especially of the high demands that air conditioning puts on peak electricity demands, we're going to really be forced to use fossil fuels to meet those, just because it's going to be much more energy intensive and it's going to come at these peak times when we have heat waves. So for that, we're probably going to have to burn some extra fossil fuel in order to be able to meet that. And because we burn extra fossil fuel, that is going to intensify our global warming effects across the planet. And because of global warming effects, we're going to be intensifying our cooling demand and our reliance on air conditioning. So therefore, when we urbanize again, we're going to have to build more and more AC. And what you guys recognize is happening here, this is a positive feedback loop. And even more scary than just the energy use that will be used right off the bat because we build buildings that have AC in tropical and arid regions, even more scary than just that initial energy use is the fact that we're going to be possibly getting us stuck in this loop, in this feedback loop. That can be very difficult. That could cost many, many generations to sort of dig ourselves out of. So I mean, because this thing isn't just a one-time cycle, because it keeps happening and it's going to keep happening, until, unless we somehow manage to break this positive feedback loop, unless we somehow break the cycle. And clearly the most obvious way to do that, and probably the easiest, is just to straight from the start, try and have these regions of the world urbanized with passive design as best we can. That is really the best way, at least that we can see at this point, to really try and break this cycle and avoid that. So that's why today's design exercise, we're going to be talking about eliminating air conditioning in an arid climate. And specifically, we're just going to be working with a single-family home, one that actually happens to be pretty near and dear to me, because this is where my girlfriend's mom and family lives. And so for that, you're going to get a bit of a backstory with this. Hopefully it'll make it a bit more interesting. But ARPAN has sent you guys out the files, the example files. Hopefully all of you, registered in time to get them. If not, we'll try and send them out again. But essentially all that we have here in this Rhino model, if you open it up, and maybe I'll even turn off the context just so we can really see. We're going to start by modeling just a single zone, because this house is essentially just a box. And it's got windows in it that we're gonna add to this zone, and we're going to start just by understanding what is the temperature conditions like in this one place, in this one house. All right, so for that, I'm going to open up Grasshopper, and we're going to start building an energy model. I'm going to show you a different way, because I've already kind of showed the surface by surface method of building up an energy model in the last two episodes, the last two series parts of the webinar. So I'm going to build up an energy model that is just that is turning a single closed volume into a zone right now, which a lot of the times is much faster if you're okay with some of the default assumptions. So I'm going to drag and drop Ladybug, Ladybug, Honeybee, Honeybee onto my canvas here to give us a start. And I'm going to bring in this single zone geometry into Grasshopper here. So I'm going to select that, set one geometry. Okay, maybe I'll internalize it just to keep it in the Grasshopper definition. So all right, so we've got our zone within our Grasshopper. I'm going to bring in the windows also, just by I've tried to organize all the windows onto the one layer for you, so you could just right click and select objects. And we're going to go set multiple geometries, and so now these windows are in Grasshopper. All right, so right off the bat, if we want to take this closed volume and turn it into a zone, all that we need to do, we just need only one component, this Honeybee masses to zones. So I'm going to drag and drop that onto the canvas, connect up my volume there, and you see the only other thing we need to run the component is a Boolean to create the HB zones. And if I set that to true, you'll see now we get a BREP out of this, and this is, as you guys already know from the previous ones, this is a BREP that has all these energy zone, these energy properties assigned to it, like schedules and loads and how people are using it. But importantly also, right now that default program, you guys might remember from the other cases, it by default just makes a zone with an office. And so we have to change this program to be representative of this single family home. And so for that, I'm going to drag and drop the Honeybee building programs component, and I'm going to just use the one residential schedule, residential program type that we have from the Department of Energy, and in this Open Studio library we're using here is the mid-rise apartment. So I'm going to take the mid-rise apartment schedule, which is pretty much is close enough for a single-family home most of the time. And then I'm going to connect this up as a building program to this Honeybee list zone programs. And then finally, I'm going to use this item selector, although you can use like a list item component or some other native Grasshopper components. And out of this whole list of, this whole list of three programs, zone programs, not too much as some of the others, I'm just going to select out the apartment. But you can see we also have, schedules and templates for an office and an apartment and a corridor. But I'm just going to say this whole thing is, I know my girlfriend's family, and it's a pretty active house. So I'm going to use just the default apartment. All right, so I'm going to connect that up to zone program, and now we have our kind of zone already ready to go for this house in LA. And importantly, though, this zone doesn't have any windows yet because we've left out the windows over here. They're not a part of this official zone. So I'm just going to drag and drop a Honeybee add HB glazing component. And what this component allows you to do, any type of Honeybee object, whether it's a surface or a full zone like what we have here, you can add child surfaces or windows essentially to that Honeybee object. And so I'm just going to connect up the Honeybee zones to our HB object there, and I'm going to connect up the windows to the child surfaces. And you see that there's some other options here like the child surface name. So you can set the construction of the windows. I know by default it's a double pane window. That's pretty close to what's on my girlfriend's house. So so I'm going to go with that right now. And importantly though, so we've got our geometry together. We've got our zone pretty much ready to simulate. I'm going to take a lot of the defaults here. Like I mean the default construction set is pretty close to, I think, what's on my girlfriend's house here. So I'm not going to change anything else. We're pretty much ready to run the energy simulation. But first, I'm going to drag and drop the Open Studio component that we use to run energy simulations that you guys will remember we've used in the last 2 episodes if you've been following along. And you'll see that again, this takes our Honeybee zones as input. All right, so we've got all of our geometry settled, but the next thing that we have to do, and maybe I'll just turn the preview off here, and I don't know, yeah, and we'll turn the wireframe on here. All right, next thing that we're going to do, though, is we can't run a simulation without having our weather file, without having our climate data file. So right now, let's see, we'll maximize Grasshopper, and I'm going to just take the Ladybug download component just to shoot us over to the big database of all publicly available weather data. I'll set that to true. And so up pops our EPW map with all the publicly available data over the planet. And I know specifically my girlfriend's family house. She lives in pretty arid climate in Reseda, California. Reseda, which is a part of Los Angeles. So I'm just going to type that in there as our name. And just to give you guys a sense, just so that you guys have an understanding of the climate that we're working with here. So LA is an enormous, sprawling city. So it's got a lot of different climates associated with it. And a lot of you, if you visited Los Angeles, you might be very familiar with this very, very mild climate that exists in central Los Angeles here. But where my girlfriend's family's house is, it's over in this valley here, the San Fernando Valley. And importantly, it's behind this big ridge of mountains, which tends to block a lot of the cool sea breezes that come in and cool down the central Los Angeles. So this is actually, Reseda is a very, very hot and dry climate. And whereas, it's actually a relatively easy thing to remove, to design a building well enough to remove an air conditioning system in central Los Angeles. And frankly, I think it's crazy that so many buildings in Los Angeles these days are air conditioned when they have such a mild climate. But it's really a challenge in the San Fernando Valley. It's much more hot and humid. So all right, so I'm going to take this weather file that comes right from the middle of the San Fernando Valley, and I'm going to copy this weather file link, and we'll hit OK. And so, all right, so we've got that weather file URL in our clipboard, and I'll just bring it into Grasshopper by hitting quotation marks, Control-V, and Enter to put it into a panel. All right, and so now we just need to bring in this weather file into Grasshopper. So I'm going to use this Ladybug Open EPW and Stat component, hook up the weather file URL, and lo and behold, we have the EPW file on our system. All right, so I'm going to connect that EPW file to the EPW file of our energy simulation. The north is pretty much good. You guys will notice, you can set an optional vector to say what the direction of north is, but I've already oriented the geometry of our model so that the y-axis is north. And you know what? While we're even at it, just because it's generally bad practice to jump right into an energy model without looking at the sun path, so I'm just going to it's still good practice as everyone watching here. And I know I opened this series by saying don't build the energy model if you haven't looked at the sun path. So just to check off the box here, and so that you guys know kind of what we're working with. So this is the direction that everything faces. So 0.25. I'm going to scale down the sun pad so we could really see it here. All right. So we got some windows on the west here that are going to get a lot of sun. We got most of our windows on the east, some on the south, but you can generally get a sense of the orientation here just by looking at the sun pad. So you have a general sense of what we're about to simulate and how it relates to the climate. All right, so we got the zones, we got the weather file. Maybe the last thing that we'll just do, because we have all the required inputs, but I just want to request some outputs here that are going to be useful for when we start to analyze the comfort in the energy model. So I'm going to drag and drop the Honeybee generate EP output component, which is under the 10 tab there, and I'm going to select